Welcome to episode 16 of the Civil War Breakfast Club. I am your co-host, Mary, and joining me tonight is the amazing Darren Weeks.
Ooh, amazing. Thank you so much, Mary. I appreciate being amazing. How are you doing today?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing pro. I'm doing good. It's a nice rainy, crappy day out, but it's okay. It's the 1st of December. Only 650 days left of 2020. And hopefully we'll get a little bit better. Yeah, it's been a good time. Had a great Facebook Live the other day. Technical difficulties notwithstanding.
Which I think I got that shit sorted out on my computer. I deleted a lot of stuff.
I know you delete up your computer. That'll create a lot of space for you. Hopefully you won't have any neighbors blowing the leaves of the lawn at 2 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning. That it was. Oh my God, I can lose my mind today. This is a very tense podcast, I think, Mary. I don't know why.
I had a snow day today.
I know you did. Did you go outside and play in the snow? Did you build Did you build a snowman?
Thought about it.
I'm sorry, a snow person?
Snow person. No, I did not, because I decided to use my time to finish up show notes that I take for our podcast tonight.
Oh, some people repair without having to have a snow day. I actually worked today. I didn't stay at home all day. Dude, it's snowing. I don't want to drive.
I gave it an effort.
You gave it the old try. Yep. You made it almost 2 miles up the road, but it's okay. But you got back, and all matters. You're safe. That you avoided that snow.
So, what are you drinking tonight before we get into our episode?
Well, considering we're talking about arguably the bloodiest battle. Well, not arguably. We'll talk details about it. The Battle of Franklin. I'm drinking Death Metal Triple IPA from the Great Trillium Brewery here in fantastic Boston, Massachusetts. Nice. And I'm drinking it out of our company mug, the Civil War Breakfast Club.
Very nice.
David and Alexis Civil War Breakfast Club mug. So here's to you.
Very nice. Well, cheers. Nobody can see that, but we are toasting each other. So I am drinking Hop Major, which is by Square Brew, which is a brewery here in my hometown of Goderich. It is a double IPA. It's 8%. And I'm drinking out of my George Henry Thomas mug because that's as close of a link as I could get to the Battle of Franklin.
He was the Rock of Plymouth, right? Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. Different battle. But hey, speaking of battles, Mary, we had a fantastic podcast last week. We finished up the Battle of Chattanooga.
Yep.
We had so much fun in the West. We decided just to stay out there the entire time. And so today we're going to talk about another battle, which is very timely, I think, considering yesterday was the anniversary. It was the Battle of Franklin that we'll be discussing tonight. This is kind of a brutal one. I mean, it's more than kind of brutal. When we talk about the whole battle, they say arguably, quotation fingers, it's the worst disaster for the Rebs on the war. I think it's more than arguably. I think it absolutely is. And we've talked about this off and on.
It is. Right? Just if you read the accounts of the soldiers that are fighting there, and some of these soldiers, they've been veterans since Shiloh. Some of them were at Gettysburg. Some of them were at Antietam. And they said they had never seen anything like what they experienced at Franklin before.
The 30th of November, 1864 in Franklin, Tennessee. We'll talk about the details in a bit. They call it the Pickett's Charge of the West, which I think is really an insult to it because
it is.
Pickett's Charge was a drop in the bucket compared to this one. I mean, this was the largest number of casualties in the shortest period of time, 5 hours on American soil. Worse than the cornfields at Antietam. It's worse on the wheat field at Gettysburg. It's worse than Cold Harbor.
Yeah.
That 5 hour period is the bloodiest span in American history. That's just the facts. That's even a math major like you could figure that one out. It just goes to show how it is. And the reason why was it's just a series of frontal assaults. Picture two boxers just standing there, just swinging and swinging and swinging. We've said this, we've talked off and on this week about this. I've always felt Franklin was such an unnecessary battle. The war was basically over at that point. And when I think of Franklin and you look at the carnage and the overall just loss of life, it is such a waste. And I mean, it's just so troubling when you read the accounts of some of these things because it never should have happened. It never, ever, ever should have happened. It was just and we'll talk about this as we go about why. It's just hard to go through all this stuff and look at this when you realize it should have been avoided.
I absolutely agree. From what I was reading, just how things played out and all that. Yeah. And just with the deaths that happened of just the number of officers that are killed here. In some way, Hood was trying for some last ditch effort, but at the same time, it was completely unnecessary, as you said. But I think we have to go back a little bit to Atlanta. The fall of Atlanta and the Battle of Franklin is part of the Franklin-Nashville campaign, which goes from September to December 27th, 1864. And it starts after the fall of Atlanta. And it's also happening while Uncle Billy is going through Georgia on his march to the sea. It involves the Army of Tennessee, which is led by John Bell Hood. His commanders are Cheatham, Stephen D. Lee, Alexander P. Stewart, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and he's also got Pat Claiborne there. On the Union side of things, you have the Army of Cumberland led by General Thomas. Schofield is leading the Army of Ohio with David Stanley. And you also have Jacob Cox and James H. Wilson, who is leading the cavalry at this time. And he's got 34,000 men. But in addition to that, he's also got another 26,000 scattered around Nashville.
So just, painting the picture. So Atlanta happens. Johnson is replaced by John Bell Hood, Kentuckian, by the way, originally, John Bell Hood. People think he's from Texas, but he's actually from Kentucky. He takes over Atlanta, and he's got this aggressive mindset. He kind of always has. His body tends to fall apart with every battle. It's just the way it is, but it shows his aggressiveness. So after Atlanta, Sherman and his band of army guys are sitting right in the town of Atlanta. Basically, Hood has a decision to make. So he's basically trying to decide what he should do. He ends up getting a visit paid to him by Jefferson Davis, and they kind of mix up a little bit. They take Hardee away from him. Hood actually threatens, or doesn't threaten to, but he actually offers to resign. For some reason, but Davis doesn't have it. So he's like, well, what you really should try to do is originally try to stay behind Sherman, just try to take Snipes in his rear guard and just kind of slow him down that way. He's just going to do something different. So he's just not going to do it. He's going to take his army and he's going to go to Nashville. That's what he wants to do. Nashville, for the last 2 previous years, has been the Union center for supplies. It's the beginning of the rail hub that connects to Chattanooga, that goes right to Atlanta and goes right to the west, right to the east, So he figures if he can get there and he can take that city, he's going to completely scuttle Sherman's plans. We'll find out later that it was completely moot because of the March to the Sea, but that's okay for now. Nashville is not really controlled by that many people. It's about 8,000 guys, but it is well entrenched by George Thomas. And so he's going to take his army, he's going to go because he feels it's vulnerable. And frankly, he's pissed. He wants to redeem himself. He got pantsed completely by Sherman. Yep. He gave up Atlanta, and he feels responsible for it. Now he's placed in charge, and he obviously wants to redeem himself. And so this is after Gettysburg, obviously, where he lost an arm. It's after Chickamauga, where he lost a leg and got his other arm damaged. So he ain't doing too good, man.
Yeah, he's basically sacrificed himself on the altar of the Confederacy, and he is expecting his men to do the same thing.
Wow, someone should coin that phrase. Wow, you should put that on a Hallmark card. But anyway, so he starts to march to Nashville. He's going to take a walk. He's going to go to Nashville. The Army of the Ohio, led by John Schofield from New York, he's been deployed to Tennessee to try to stop him. He's going to try to just kind of ding him a little bit. He has his own supply issues that slow him down. Schofield's army was kind of scattered and disorganized as well. What he wants to do is he wants to join Thomas and reunite in Nashville. Thomas basically says, listen, you need to get up here, but before you get here, you're going to try to get that Franklin area and just get to that Harpath, that river, and just kind of stay there. And you want to play defense. But you want to get up here. The opposite is what Hood wants. Hood does not want him to connect with him. He wants to beat him before he gets there. So the race is on.
Yeah, and that's where you have a series of battles that make up the Franklin-Nashville campaign. So you have Battle of Elletona on October 5th, Resaca on October 12th, and then Hood goes into Alabama to reassess his strategy. And then you have Forrest raiding in western Tennessee between October 16th and November 16th. There's the Battle of Decatur on October 26th to 29th, the Battle of Columbia on the 24th. And finally, that leads us to Spring Hill on November 29th. And just to let our listeners know, we will be covering this campaign more in depth at some point.
Yeah.
We've just chosen to focus on a little bit on Spring Hill, but not too much, but mainly on the Battle of Franklin and just what it means in the whole Civil War.
But you see, you focus on a couple of things we should mention, though. But Columbia, first of all. I see this campaign, I sort of see it like Roadrunner, that cartoon. Yep. Where Hood is chasing Schofield and he just gets him within reach and then he loses him. And it happens over and over and over again. So he finally catches Schofield at Columbia trying to get across the Duck River. They must have had ducks. That's why they call it the Duck River. So
I wanted to call it something else.
Oh, shock. But anyway, so Schofield is basically gets some pontoon boats set up over the Duck River and he gets over that bridge and maybe about an hour before Hood just misses him. So now Hood is pissed. So he's already starting to get mad because he sees him and just loses him. And it's going to be a repeating thing now. So he pursues him, and now we get to Spring Hill, and he gets him again. Now, before we get into the details of Spring Hill, we have to talk a little bit about the weather. This is Tennessee. This is late November. The weather's kind of unpredictable. It goes from the mid 40s to sleet, and it's cold and it's muddy. It's just shitty. It's just a bad time. These soldiers are tired of marching in the cold weather.
Yeah.
On both sides, but especially Hood's guys. So he gets there. Just imagine these guys marching in slow weather, just the cold. You can just picture how it's going, carrying all their gear, kind of like you shoveling off the car today, I imagine. Pretty much just kind of how that's probably what the Confederates probably were going through.
That was, I don't ever want to do that again, but I know I'm going to because of where I live.
Well, that's right. So Schofield, he gets to Spring Hill, and he knows he's vulnerable to attack. He's spread out.
Yep.
He's kind of all over the place. And this is the 29th of November. So this is really where Hood screws up, at least the second time. But this is the big one. This is the Spring Hill fiasco. So he gets there. He knows his guys need sleep. He knows they're tired. Nathan Bedford Forrest is saying, just give me some infantry. I can get these guys right now. He's like, no. These guys have been marching. Let them get their sleep. We'll bag these guys in the morning. As history will show, while he was sleeping, Schofield basically gets up in the middle of the night and he ditches. He gets the hell out of Dodge. So while they slept, the army literally passed by the sleeping rebels within gunshot. They just walked right by. But they left in a mad rush. I mean, they left wagons and gear and shit all the way from Spring Hill all the way to Franklin. It's really the beginning of a lot of mistakes by Hood. You know, Hood, I mean, he's someone who, a really good soldier, obviously a very questionable general.
Hood is one of these men that is like Burnside or Hooker, where you're better off in a lower level of command. When you're in command of an entire army, you struggle a little bit more, I think.
Well, sometimes the best players don't make the best coaches, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's the same concept.
Yeah.
So picture John Bell Hood. He wakes up. He's getting ready to go bag Schofield, and they're gone. So you know what it is? Now he's pissed. I mean, he's legit mad. That fabulous quote, he was wrathy as a rattlesnake.
I love that.
He's got the old burr in his saddle. Now he's hell-bent. Now, because he lost him at the Duck River. Now he lost him in an embarrassing style here over at Spring Hill. So now he's like, I'm getting these fucking guys. I don't care. We're going. We're getting them. So he basically is like, you know what? We're going to send the whole damn army at him. We're going to get him now. We have to get him before he gets through Franklin. He's going to go to that Harpath River. We're never going to see him again. Now is our time. He thought that because maybe the fast exit from Spring Hill, he would get to Franklin and probably wouldn't have time to prepare. Didn't think that he'd have the gall to finally get ready to go. So he figured now is the time. So let's go and get him. His generals don't like it, but that's what he's doing.
He's blaming his subordinates, though, for what happened. So he specifically singles out Cheatham. In this meeting he has with Cheatham, and he says, this is on you, especially on Claiborne and Brown. His best player is Claiborne, probably, and he's saying that this is his fault. When Cheatham told this to Claiborne, Claiborne was really bothered by that, and I'm wondering now if that played into some of how Claiborne was at Franklin, that he was like, I need to prove this shouldn't be on me, kind of thing. And
no,
I don't think it absolutely should have been on the subordinates at all.
No, of course. I mean, first of all, you know, there's an old phrase, the buck stops here, right?
Yeah.
Hood, better for worse, he's the guy. His name is on the marquee. So Patrick Claiborne probably felt pretty good about himself since Chattanooga. He's been doing really, really well.
Yeah.
It was almost like a football team is going into a game tomorrow and the coach tells the press, well, we're probably going to lose, but it's going to be my quarterback's probably going to suck. That's how Claiborne must have felt. Kind of basically laying the groundwork for excuses already because he knew it was going to be brutal. I mean, he had to have known.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is like Spring Hill is a complete breakdown of communication. But as you said, they head to Franklin where they're going to face a full frontal assault. So already this is bigger than Pickett's charge.
Nothing scarier than full frontal, Mary. You know.
But Schofield's got there the night before. He arrives at, I think, about 4 a.m.
He gets there right around dawn, so whatever time that was. But so he gets there about dawn o'clock, we'll call it there, okay? And he immediately begins building these defensive preparations. The breastworks. Now, he's lucky because there was a previous battle there in April of 1863, so there were kind of ready-made breastworks still, so it didn't have to start from scratch like Culp's Hill or Chattanooga or anything. They had some ready-made stuff. So they're digging in. So they're back to the Harpeth River, for one. First thing he notices, Schofield that is those bridges are gone. So he's having engineers fix those bridges because he knows the reality is win, lose, or draw, they're going to need those bridges to get to Nashville.
Yeah.
So he's going to have them work on them. In the meantime, he's going to place his army in a semicircle south of Franklin. Picture left to right, you're going to have Nathan Kimball followed by Thomas Ruger, and then James Riley. You're going to have those divisions going right across. This is the 23rd and the 4th Corps. Basically, you're going to have a center point being Carter House. We'll talk some more about the formations, but some things that are interesting about this battle, okay, is this was an infantry battle. The cavalry was limited. Talked before about the Union had James Wilson, and the Rebs had Nathan Bedford Forrest. But the terrain and the rivers were very limiting, not to mention the number of guys in a short period of place. So there wasn't a lot of space for them. The other issue is the artillery. Now, artillery is always the great equalizer in these battles, but the Union had 2 batteries from Nashville, all they had. And they were positioned over at Fort Granger, which was the headquarters of Schofield. The Rebs had very few of them because they needed to keep up with Schofield, and that was slowing them down. So they left them, and they were just going forward. So what you have here is you have an infantry mano-a-mano battle. It's going to get pretty ugly, as we'll find out. But Schofield's going to dig in. He's going to make Carter House basically his command center, which is going to be Jacob Cox's headquarters ultimately. And he's going to dig in. He's going to wait for Hood.
One thing to mention, too, going back to Pickett's Charge thing, is the Confederates at Pickett's Charge did, what was it, a 90-minute artillery barrage?
It was 2 hours.
There's nothing like this going on at Franklin. Might get some hate over this. I'm not sure. I'm going to say this isn't really like Pickett's Charge just for that reason, because you're not comparing apples to apples.
Well, at Pickett's Charge, the Rebs had 147 cannon.
Yeah.
Okay. The Union had 122. So that's 269 guns for 2 hours going at each other to set up the infantry. You had none of that.
Yeah.
So you had infantry on infantry, full banana with no artillery support whatsoever. Yeah. You got to mention again the topography. I've not been to Franklin, admittedly. You got 2 roads. You got the Carter Creek Pike going in one direction, but then what you have is these fields where you got the river. Dare I say you have undulations, Mary? Right?
I read that. Remember I sent that to you last night?
You did. That's why I said that.
I was like, fuck, undulations.
You have undulations. The other one is the Columbia Pike. So you have these 2 roads, and the soldiers are in between them with all the undulations in between. That's pretty much the setup. So you've got Schofield dug in. You've got very little artillery. You've got very little cavalry. And what you basically have, the Union sitting back, this time on defense, in a very strong fortified position, waiting for John Bell Hood with something up his ass looking for a fight.
And that's where Hood has a meeting with his commanders. Now, before that meeting, they arrive close to where the battle is going to take place. And Cleburne, admittedly, probably is not feeling very good at this point, about what has happened the day before, because he's the one being blamed for it. The one thing we wanted to do when we set out with this podcast is both sides. We wanted to humanize them. We wanted to make them more human to people and all that. So Cleburne, when they arrive, it's kind of some downtime. So he finds a stick and he finds some dirt and he draws a checkerboard. And apparently he must have carried the pieces with him, and he called one of his staff over. And they are playing a game of checkers when Hood has sent a messenger to Cleburne and has said, you need to come meet with me. Keep in mind, this is a few hours before Cleburne is going to die. So one of the last things that he does as, not as a soldier, but as a human, is play checkers.
And this goes to show the Confederates are playing checkers, the Union's playing chess. they're ready. They're pinned back, but it does humanize them ready. But
just him going to that meeting, he's probably like, oh fuck, this is not going to be good, because he and Cheatham had, I think, they either speak before or after this. Cleburne actually says to him, this will be a terrible and useless waste of life. At the meeting with Hood, Cleburne is quiet. He only says this to Cheatham. It's either before or afterwards when they see each other. But Hood says in this meeting, we will make this fight. Forrest is there and he protests. He says no. And this is when he goes back to his whole, no, give me one good division and I'll take my cavalry and I'll drive them to Nashville. And Hood is like, we're not driving them to Nashville. We're going to fucking annihilate them and wipe them off the battle map. Like, he's got it in his head now that this, for whatever reason, has to happen. Cheatham also says that I do not like the looks of this fight.
And then he finishes, the enemy has an excellent position and is well fortified. So they knew. I mean, this is late in the war. This is not rookies here. These dudes have seen it all. They've seen everything. So they know what they're in for right off the bat. And that's what they get. I mean, Schofield, he's going to set up his headquarters over at the Truett House, but he's going to spend most of his time at that Fort Granger, which is across the Harpeth River. But that's where the artillery is. So he ends up being in a pretty strong, safe position to watch. And this is where it gets kind of, we see a little controversy starting moving a little bit because, Stanley's 4th Corps, he's going to move Wagner's division, who is the last to arrive on the battlefield, about a half a mile in front. And they kind of make, a quasi-salient sort of, with basically going to ultimately have two brigades with John Lane and Joseph Conrad are going to be there. Cameron Opdyke is supposed to be there. He's got different plans. So Stanley tells Wagner, division commander, to hold his, this is where it gets a little confusing. He says, hold his position until dark. That's what he says. And dark isn't that long away. It's a couple hours. For whatever reason, Wagner hears, hold his position at all costs. And Wagner's like, are you shitting me? This like, no, you know. So Opdyke hears this, and he goes, you know what? I'll be seeing you. He goes back behind the Union lines. He sees what's potentially coming. And that's a mistaken order right there. Again, communication where you're only supposed to be out there for a couple hours. He thinks they're going to stay out there. Opdyke apparently decides he doesn't want to do it. We'll hear about him here in a little bit. But it sets up a really ugly situation at the beginning for the Union, is what it does.
This is when Cleburne meets back with his men, including a man named Daniel C. Govan, and he commanded the Arkansas Brigade of Cleburne's division. Cleburne tells him the orders are to carry the works of the enemy at all hazards and then move on the flank and until they come under fire, and then they're just supposed to just charge. So they're supposed to just keep marching towards the Union Army. Well, once they start getting fired at, that's when they're supposed to do their thing, and they're supposed to use their bayonet to take the works. And Govan, he salutes Cleburne, and Cleburne looks at him and says, well, Govan, if we are to die, let us die like men.
They knew. They knew. So,
and prior to this, he has said to Hood, like Hood gives him his orders to move his men forward. And Cleburne says to him, I'll take those works or I will fall trying. Like Cleburne, like he had to know.
I mean, they do, but you know, Hood, you know, he gets in. He gets to Winstead Hill, which is south of the city, probably around 1 o'clock or so, 1:30, 2 o'clock, depending on what time whoever you listen to. These guys are tired. They're cold. They've had about 6 hours of sleep in the last 2 full days. These Confederates. They know this battle is going to be absolutely brutal. But Hood, to your point, he says, we got to go full frontal attack. This is probably now you're looking at maybe 4 o'clock or so. Mm-hmm. And this is where it gets this is where the Hood thing, you get that he's seeing the Union in his mind a vulnerable position because they just got there. Maybe it reminds me a lot of Ewell at Cemetery Hill.
Yep.
Maybe hit them before they get entrenched. Yep. And so maybe that's what Hood's thinking. Who knows? But he basically orders a frontal assault. He's only got about 45 minutes left of life, right? I mean, this is probably 4:30 or so. It's November, so it gets dark. His generals, aren't liking that too much. He honestly feels that I need to hit Schofield before he can strengthen his fortifications. He just thinks that now is the time to do it because he's so afraid of Schofield getting through Franklin and getting to Thomas and Nashville. I just think he really wants to prove himself after Atlanta, and he wants to bag the big fish. And this is where, his aggressiveness is probably going to get him. To your point, he's going to order Cheatham's army and Stuart's guys in. Cheatham's going to be on the left. Stuart's going to be on the right. He's going to take Nathan Bedford Forrest cavalry, and he's going to split them on both flanks. So he's going to basically take the left and the right of Chalmers and Jackson and his other guys. He's going to put them on the ends, just what the cavalry is supposed to be. You always want to be at the end of the army. He's going to send them in. They're going to run through Wagner's guys pretty quick. So those 2 brigades are pushed out. Conrad and Lane are going to get pushed back pretty quickly, pretty easily. They're not going to stand much of a chance. It's about 3,000 guys going up against the full, the entire Confederate army of Hood. They're going to fall back pretty quickly to Columbia Pike. They'll lose about 700 guys just by being captured alone. And they're going to be literally chased right to the Union breastworks. They're going to be pushed almost full speed now that the Union center is basically attacked by Cleburne and French and those guys. It's going to certainly weaken that middle. It's going to make the middle part of that line very, very, very vulnerable.
Yeah, and that's what's referred to as the breakthrough, right?
Yep.
That they have. And that's when Opdyke comes into play, is when he sees that happening. He takes matters into his own hands. He just is like, I got to do this. And his commanding officer actually walked by him. I believe it was David Stanley was the commanding officer. Stanley. And he said, I gave the colonel no orders as I saw him engaged in doing the very thing to save us to get possession of our line again. So he's joined with the reserve elements of Riley's division, the 12th and 16th Kentucky, and survivors from Wagner's division, as you just explained. Some of them run back. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they managed to seal this breach, but it is some of the most horrific fighting in order to do it.
Emerson Opdyke, interesting guy. I mean, he's from Ohio, but no one's perfect. His father fought in the War of 1812. His grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War. he's got a little bit of hero in his blood, I guess. And link it up with those 12 and the 16th, the Kentucky boys are plugging that gap in the center. I think that's one of those things where people study it, and I think they realize that what would have happened if it didn't happen is you would have split up Schofield's army right down the middle. Right up the middle, you would have gone right through that gap.
Yeah.
So what Updike did is really stabilize that middle.
Yeah.
And some people don't agree with that, but I think that's pretty it's pretty obvious what he did.
I think that's exactly what he did with, like, you know, he stabilized the middle. He's fighting on Snodgrass Hill at Chickamauga too, and I posted a photo on my Twitter account of the monument, which they were called Opdyke's Tigers. So he's there too. So his men they're probably accustomed to doing stuff like this. Like, we got to make this happen and prevent the Rebs from getting through here. But yeah, and this is also where the Missouri Brigade is, right?
Yep. This one gets really ugly too, because you got to figure, you know, it's getting darker out. It's sleety. Is that a word?
Yeah, sleet.
Okay, so sleety word? Okay. But regardless, it's muddy, it's crappy, it's dark. You know, this is really when the hand-to-hand fighting at Carter House is really going to get underway, right? So you're going to have guys hitting with axes, picks, you know, rocks, tridents, rifle butts, whatever they get their hands on. They're going to be so close to each other, and they're going to be covered in mud, they can't distinguish one from the other. There's also so many guys so close together, they just can't fire. So it turns into literal mano a mano, hours of fighting around this Carter House and around these Union breastworks. You know, guys like John C. Brown, you know, we'll hear about later on, because he didn't make it.
Yeah.
You know, his division took heavy casualties. It's just an ugly, ugly battle. And think of like Gettysburg with like this echelon attack, right? Where you send in Wilcox, and you send in Lane, you send in Ambrose Wright, you send in Posey, you send in Mahone. It's not like that. This is all hands on deck now, right?
Yeah.
So this is going on. It moves on to the right side of the Columbia Pike, and now you're going to have Cleburne and French and Walthall starting to move in.
Yeah, and this is actually where pretty quickly they think it was within about 20 minutes that Cleburne gets shot and killed.
He does. He ends up getting right into the cotton gin. Basically what happens is they're going to hit James Riley's brigade along with Casements on that left-hand side. Cleburne, we'll talk about him in a little while in more detail, but he's going to get killed along with 14 of his regimental commanders. They're going to be casualties. And a big part of it is some of these Union guys, like we were talking about at Chickamauga, they had Spencer repeaters.
Yeah.
There were guys from the 12th Kentucky and 65th Illinois who had a gun called Henry rifles. There was 350 men who had these. These are 16-shot lever-action rifles. They could shoot 10 shots per minute, some of these Union guys.
Some of these Confederates have already gone up against weapons like these in previous battles as well. Just to give you an idea of what it's like here, there's a quote I found from a guy that was in the Missouri Brigade, Captain James Cinnamon. He said, "It seemed to me that the air was all red and blue with shells and bullets, screeching and howling everywhere over and through us as we rushed across the cotton field strewn with fallen men." So as he's going in, there's already dead that they're running over. So that's this battle. The one thing to take away from it, it's absolute carnage. It's horrible.
It is, and it's almost like what's interesting about Franklin, Mary, is that a lot of the battles remind you of different battles. We've already referenced a handful already. But, you know, when Alexander Stewart's guys go in, okay, and they're going to be attacking the Union left. You mentioned Cleburne, but all, you know, French and Walthall, and also Loring, who apparently found himself after Vicksburg. He disappeared off the plan, and now he's back. So now he's back, okay? So Loring's back. You've got a lot of troops in it because of the topography again, undulations notwithstanding, Mary, and a small
rolling
area,
hills.
Rolling, okay, you know what, it's undulation. But again, think of a bigger version of Ball's Bluff now, right? Where you got a bunch of guys elbow to elbow, and they can't move. Imagine that. So you're trying to charge against this heavily defended breastworks, and now you're in the subway, right?
Yeah.
Remember I mentioned those 2 artillery batteries over there in Fort Granger?
Yeah. As you point.
As I point. They're over there. You see them? Okay. So I'm pointing at Fort Granger, okay? So those guns start firing. So now the artillery is coming down because this is on the right side of the Confederate line, which is the closest to the artillery. So they're getting hit by those batteries. They're also running into those Union abatis in the trenches that are right there. Loring, the North Carolina guy, he's on the right. They're starting to get hit by canister already, right off the bat, because they are the closest. What does Loring's troops do? They turn and they YOLO it. Fuck this.
Yeah,
right?
there was a few of them that did that.
And Loring says that famously, he stands up and yells, "Great God, am I commanding cowards?" That's what he yells. And they looked at him and basically said, "Yep." And you know what he does? He does like Augustus Van Horn Ellis at Gettysburg, Mary. He jumps on his horse, and he's going to show personal leadership and inspire his troops. He jumps on the horse to show leadership, doesn't get hit, but you know what happens? the guys take off anyway.
Oh, fuck. That's so frustrating.
And so hey, you know what? At least you tried. So,
Yeah, like I did today driving to work.
And so they do fall back. Next to Loring, right to Loring's left is Edward Walthall. We talked about him at Chattanooga last week. He made 6 different attacks. Every single one of them was repulsed right after the other.
Yeah.
One of his brigade commanders, a guy named William Quarles, actually got past the earthworks, but he got there and was pinned, and he was just stuck.
Yeah.
There's one story where a soldier said he was laying on the grass on his back looking up at the sky, and all he could see was bullets flying, which I don't know how that's possible, especially at night, but we'll go with it. Okay.
Oh, that's crazy. Walthall's advance was apparently done under the most deadly fire of both small arms and artillery that I have ever seen troops subjected to. That's what one person said about it. And another one said that I can't see how any human being could live 2 minutes in such a place. And that was a lieutenant with the 43rd Mississippi.
I mean, where they were was pure hell on earth. The right side, or the east side of Columbia Pike, that was all within range of the artillery. There was only 2 batteries. It wasn't like you're talking about those 147 Confederate guns on Seminary Ridge here. But they were powerful, though, and they were driving them back. So Loring, Walthall, French, Claiborne, but especially French, Walthall, and Loring were all subject to this artillery. Nathan Bedford Forrest is trying to go over the river and get around, but he can't because he can't ford it. Ironically, today it's called Forest Crossing, where he was supposed to cross. True story. But that's where he was supposed to go. But they couldn't really make it. Chalmers, the other cavalry guy, he's trying to go on the left-hand side. It's a little bit easier, but they're not getting anywhere anyway. It's around 7 o'clock. It's getting late. William Bate, another guy in Cheatham's army, he's going to basically get pushed back. He's going to be a place called Everbright Mansion, but he's going to fall back as well because, again, there's no cavalry support.
So he is taking on his left flank is supposed to be protected by Chalmers Cavalry Division, but it's not. And that's due to the rolling ground and the orchards, and as well as the daylight is
What's
disappearing.
Rolling Ground called again?
Oh my God. It was in one of the sources I read.
Your source said undulations because you showed me.
No, this is not the same fucking thing. It's a different page.
Hey, Darren, look, it's at undulations, and that's what you were talking about. So,
Fucker.
Point LaRusso.
Fucker. I'll send you the actual quote.
Okay, whatever. But anyway, Chalmers,
Chalmers.
Of the undulations, okay, can't get across.
Yeah. And it's dark, too. Bate is like, well, what am I going to do now? And he said the federal line looked the more grim and angry as the smoke of the battle thickened and the shadows of evening grew. So it's almost like they're going into some kind of hell, which is what a lot of these men start referring to this battle too, because as it gets darker, you're going to see more of the light of the cannons, of the musketry. One guy, Henry Riddick of the 1st Florida, said, "Our boys began dropping like corn before a hailstorm."
Must have been hell on earth for these guys. I mean, just the whole thing. Just picture the cold and the sleet and the dark and the guns. 7 o'clock comes. Stephen D. Lee finally arrives. At least Allegheny Johnson's division does arrive, and he's going to move into support on the right. But he gets pinned down on the breastworks pretty quickly. Again, darkness was a huge part of that. I think he made one assault and got his ass kicked and
that was
off.
it.
I mean, he's like, you know what? This is freaking stupid.
And then Bate and Cheatham have to go to him and say, dude, be careful with your fire, because they had men laying down in the ditches at this point. So at this point in the battle, the men that have made the first part of the assault at around 4 o'clock, some of them are laying in ditches, and some of them reported that their clothes became soaked in blood because of the dead men that were lying around them. Bro. And Reddick, who the quote I read before, he said that they could not go forward or back. And they laid there until around 11 o'clock when the battle finally stopped. But some men that were in the 1st Florida with Reddick, they got up and they just left after about 10 minutes. They were like, fuck this, we're not doing this. And they got cut down. So that's what these men are laying in. And that's why when Lee comes along, like, they can't unleash what they need to, because they could hit their own men at this point. And that just goes back to like how chaotic this battle is. And his men were also ordered, a man from the 41st Mississippi said, we were ordered to omit the usual yell. So they're not able to do the usual rebel yell that they do. Conceal our approach under cover of darkness and make a spirited dash for the works. And then it's at the very end, once they know they're close, that they do their rebel yell, because a lot of the Union sources, in what I read, they they reported hearing the rebel yell at this battle quite a bit. But Stephen Lee, the general doing this part of the charge, he said it looked as if the division was moving into the very door of hell, lighted up with its sulfurous flames.
Wow. Sounds like a trip over to Mary's house.
Fucker.
All seriousness, on all honesty, our words cannot describe how absolutely brutal this battle was.
No.
And this was, you know what, and we mentioned at the beginning of this, you know, you think about Civil War ground zero, right? What do you think of? You think of the cornfields. You think of Devil's Den, Antietam. You think of the wheat fields. You think of Cold Harbor, right? You think of the Mule's Shoe at Spotsylvania. You think of, but this one is the king. I mean, well, just picture, and this was the last really great battle of the Civil War. This was it. This is the firework display. This was the grand finale of this war. Everything gone. This was it. And when anybody tells you what Civil War battles was the single most brutal, the answer is Franklin. And it's not even close.
Absolutely. And that's how I came away from this. Like, I thought, like, okay, like, I mean, I knew about Franklin, and I knew it was brutal. But when you start doing the research and you read the quotes of these men, like there was a soldier from Alabama who said, and this goes right back to what you just said, Darren, you cannot have the slightest imagination of how many men were killed, such a slaughter of men never seen before. And keep in mind that some of these men fighting at Franklin, they fought at Shiloh. They've been in it since the beginning. So you can't imagine like what they've seen. And now they're seeing the worst ever.
I mean, this is like the hornet's nest times 10. People talked about, you know, the worst hell they've ever seen in their life was at Shiloh. But you know, going back to one thing I forgot to mention about Forrest real quick. So he's on the far right, and he gets pushed back by Joseph Wilson's dismounted cavalry. It was significant because it was the only time, or the first time rather, that he got beat by a smaller force in the entire war. So even Forrest, he's up against the river, and he's in a limited space as well. But again, it just goes to show what a complete and utter disaster this battle was for everybody in the Confederacy.
It was so chaotic. And I don't think, like, you know, sending in Allegheny Johnson's men was just like, why do that at 7:00 at night? You know, and a soldier from the 110th Ohio was surprised when he saw more men, like realized they were there. And he said that Johnson's attack was foredoomed to failure. His men served but to increase the heaps of dead and wounded which strewed the field. Like even the Union at this point are like, what are they doing?
Well, they know. And while this is going on, Schofield is continuing to develop those bridges, right? Allegheny Johnson fails. He gets pushed back. This is what Hood says. You know what? Fuck this. We're done, right? He says he's going to do the whole Sherman thing. We'll lick him in the morning. That's what he's going to say. So he stops the offensive attack after Johnson. About 11 o'clock, Thomas orders Schofield to pack him up and get the hell out of Dodge and get to Nashville, you know. Kenny Chesney's playing up here tonight. We get here tonight. So get to Nashville. So they start to leave. What's interesting about this battle, right, is tactically, by definition, this battle was a Confederate victory, right? They drove the Feds off the field. That's
and they hold Franklin at the end of the day.
And they hold Franklin. But does anybody honestly think Franklin's a Confederate victory?
I don't know how to think of Franklin. I don't know if I see it as a Union victory or I see it as a Confederate victory. It's absolute slaughter.
Confederate Pyrrhic victory, as they say.
Yeah.
I mean, they by definition, they won, because by definition, they won the field, they drove the enemy off, but they got their asses kicked. It was a victory that cost them everything.
It did.
They went forward. You know, Schofield goes off to Nashville. He's going to get there by noon the next day, which is exactly 156 years ago today, around December 1st. He does link up with Thomas, so his mission is achieved. He is going to get pursued by Hood. But again, you know, not to jump ahead, but Hood attacks again on December 15th at Nashville, gets his ass kicked again, and that's the end. That's it for Hood. Looking back at the aftermath of this battle, we've talked about what the citizenry had to deal with at Antietam and at Gettysburg and Vicksburg and all these horrific battles. But remember, at this battle, right, why speed was the whole thing. So they left most of the wagons behind with the artillery. So this wagons included all the medical supplies, right? There was very few doctors. So now you don't have supplies to deal with the wounded. So the dead and wounded are basically taken over many places, including Carndon House, some churches. Carndon House, and you know, there's still blood on the floor. At Carndon House, the pile of arms and legs was 2 men high or 3 Marys high, however you want to look at it. And
5'9"?
it was that
5'9" times 3.
but it was pretty high. But there's some horrible stories where, it's cold and sleet and mud, and they're covering the dead bodies in the battlefield. They found a guy who was alive 9 days later. His legs had been shot off, and he was still alive, and they found him.
And just the cold that settles in.
Yeah.
And the other thing too that happens is, before the fighting stops, there's been so many commanders killed that some of these men are going without their commanders. This happens with Cleburne's men. And I think it happens with States Rats. Gist is killed.
It's funny, I can't say without the accent either now. It's so funny. States Rats.
States Rats. But Cleburne's men.
We'll hear about him later, unfortunately.
Yeah. Cleburne's men are there. The fighting is still going on. And they began to wonder where he is. And they said, we kept going over, but they would reinforce and drive us out. So the Unions driving them back out. And finally, they decided to keep quiet until Cleburne came along. One of Cleburne's men said, we waited and waited and waited. And the boys kept crying for word and wondered why he didn't come. But when the orders didn't come, I knew Pat Cleburne was dead. For if he had been living, he would have given us that order. Right there, that's a testament to how loyal his men are to him and what he meant to them. It's not just happening with Cleburne's, it's happening with Gist's men as well.
Yeah. And we'll go over the butcher's bill here in a few minutes. It was just brutal. But you talk about just the hell on earth, right? Do you know that the Confederates had a bonfire where they burned body parts in wagons, and it burned for 2 weeks?
Oh, God.
After this battle? 2 weeks of burning body parts in wagons. There wasn't a lot of horses because they didn't have any cavalry. Think of hell, right?
Yeah.
Think of body parts burning at a bonfire. That's what they were doing. But as bad as these battles are, and the one consistent thing about Civil War battles is there's always kind of goodness that comes out of humanity with these things. It's somehow war and battles brings out the worst and the best of people.
Yep.
There's that story of a guy named E.M. Bounds. Have you heard of him? E.M. Bounds, he was a pastor from Missouri. Okay. He basically had a church in Missouri, which the church was owned or allegedly owned by some Confederates or a Confederate guy. He was not a Confederate. He was one of four or five brothers. The other ones were all fighting for the Union. He stayed back because he was a pastor. The Union catches him and accuses him of being a Confederate. So they put him in jail, and they trade him for a Union pastor. So they send him to the Confederate line. What? You know where he gets sent? He gets sent to Franklin. So he's at Franklin, and so he's a Union guy helping basically Confederate Missouri people. So he's in Franklin after the battle. He's helping to find the rebel dead. He helped set up that Confederate cemetery, which housed at the time 1,500 dead Confederates. He helped the town recover. So he was kind of like the angel of Marye's Heights, sort of, where he was a guy who was a Union guy who got by happenstance got sent to the Confederacy to help Confederate soldiers, and that's exactly what he did. And so it's just one of those good stories. But at the end of the day, with this battle, this was the nail in the coffin. I mean, if the Confederacy wasn't dead at this point, I mean, before the battle, it certainly was now. This was it. They were completely done. Like we said, this was the last hurrah. This is the last big battle. The casualties, well, I know you like to do the casualty numbers because you have a grim sense of humor, but let you go ahead and do that.
On the Confederate side, there's 6,252 casualties. Of these, 1,750 are killed, 3,800 are wounded, and 702 are missing or captured. And on the Union side, there's 2,326, 189 killed, 1,033 wounded.
You mentioned 6,200 Confederate casualties. Hood will say 4,500.
Yep, Hood downplays.
So he must have sat next to you in math class. Is what
he did.
Okay.
I was helping him with his math exam.
You must have been sitting to his right.
Just a side note, I was somebody's math tutor once.
Oh my goodness gracious! So wow. Anyway, we'll leave that
where
alone.
She is now, but anyway.
I'm guessing she ain't working for NASA. But you know what? Another thing that's a good what if of these stories too is we always do the what if thing. You know what Arthur MacArthur is?
Yep, I do.
It's a funny name to say, kind of. He was a guy who was from Springfield, Massachusetts, not far from where I am. Okay, he was part of the 24th Wisconsin. He was at Franklin. He was shot in the chest, but yet somehow lived. He ended up being the father, Douglas MacArthur, from World War I, World War II in Korea, who was instrumental in those victories. Can you imagine if old Arthur MacArthur had died at Franklin?
That's
how that
one
could
of
have
my
changed history,
probably one of my
right?
favorite stories from this battle. It's like wow, that guy was there fighting, and he's
He was a baller too, you know. I mean, he
yeah.
was tough
He was at
record.
Missionary Ridge as well. He was
He
with
was.
Thomas's men at, I think, at Missionary Ridge. He was
You
one
know,
of
I
the
know
ones charged up there.
Wisconsin claims him, but he's a masshole. He's one of us. He's one of us, Mary. That's why he survived. He was made of steel. You can't kill Arthur MacArthur. He's still alive today. We talked about the death toll for the Confederacy, and you cannot talk about the rebel dead without talking about the real high generals they lost in this battle.
Yeah,
Okay?
states' rights gist.
States' rights gist. He didn't make it. We talked about Otto Strahl didn't make it. Hiram Granberry, brutal death.
Granberry, his last words were, "Never let it be said Texans lagged in the fight." And then he ends up getting shot a couple times. One of them is through his head, and he crumbles to the ground when that happens.
John Carter, he doesn't count as, he was mortally wounded, so you have a total of 6 dead generals. Of course, the headliner is, I've been dreading bringing this up, Mary, because I know you're going to get emotional. I was going to play some sad music for you, but we have to talk about Patrick Cleburne, because Patrick Cleburne, unfortunately, we mentioned this, he is killed in this battle. We've talked about how both of us have definitely an admiration for him, as far as probably, in my opinion, he was the best general on the field at Chattanooga, probably the best general on the field here.
Yep.
And he's a guy, when you look at the bigger picture, how this battle never should have happened, it made no sense. And the reason why I say, to go back to this real quick, before we get to Cleburne, 2020 hindsight being our benefactor, we know now that Sherman did his march to the sea and he lived off the land.
Yep.
He did not need the supplies. So Hood going to Nashville to cut Sherman's supply line was completely irrelevant. It did not matter. Now, there was a lot that went into it beyond that. He wanted to, Hood being aggressive and all that. I guess people think it's overrated a little bit, but you cannot deny the human psychology of this in the military. But they basically went to stop a supply line that did not matter, right? And it cost him the life of a guy named Patrick Cleburne. Now, I know you're a big fan of his, so I'm just going to sit back and I'm going to watch you get misty. As you put on your black shawl and start to.
As I said in last week's episode, the reason I got into Cleburne is because of Missionary Ridge and what he did to Sherman there. I admire him very much as a soldier, as a commander, a guy who comes over from Ireland and no West Point education, and he rises through the ranks. And unfortunately, he never gets chosen for command. I believe it's because of his emancipation that he wrote to put slaves in the Confederate Army. I don't think it was anything to do with the fact that he was Irish or not West Point educated. I think he had the talent to be a commander of an army, and he was just passed over because of that emancipation. Do I agree with his reasons for fighting? Absolutely not. But I do believe the one thing that Cleburne would have been after the Civil War is like a Longstreet. He would have come around and he would have, I think, realized, we need to be unified again. And this is truly not going to happen. It is a lost cause, because if you read any biography about Cleburne, he actually is a very accepting individual. He was a Protestant, or Episcopalian, I guess I should say, for the Irish out there, but he
starts with a P. I found out last night.
He knew what kind of prejudice the Catholics experienced in America, and he didn't agree with that at all. So he's a very different type of, I think, person to study in the Confederate Army. He raises a lot of questions, and that's why I like him. And too, just like, he was a kind person, and also he's a very talented soldier. But the one thing that we want to talk about is when he was found on the battlefield.
He had brutal death. I mean, this is he's fighting, against the 23rd and the 4th Corps divisions of them. He's had 2 horses shot from under him. Finally, when he's trying to climb into the saddle and the horse gets shot. Yeah. Finally, he's gonna go without.
Govan sees him. Basically, the last image Govan has of him is running off through the smoke, and he never sees him again. And the next that we hear of Patrick Cleburne is from a man named John McQuaid, who was one of the ones that found his body the next day. And this is what he had to say. He lay flat upon his back as if asleep, his military cap partly covering his eyes. He had on a new gray uniform. It was unbuttoned and opened, the lower part of the vest unbuttoned and open. He wore a white linen shirt, which was stained with blood on the front part of the left side, or just left of the abdomen. This was the only sign of a wound I saw on him, and I believe it was the only one he received. And then after that, Claiborne's body is taken and laid out at Carnton with the other generals that had been killed there. Now Claiborne is without his boots; they'd been taken, without his sword.
So what happened was they basically, his body was found. He was, all of his valuables are gone. You mentioned his boots were gone, his valuables, his sword, some other stuff. He was found by a couple of Mississippi soldiers, and you mentioned before, right at dawn. And what's interesting about this is he was found on his back with his hands across his chest, like he was sleeping. Now, what's interesting, and we got talking about this last night, chances are, and we just speculating, okay, was some soldiers found his body, oh look, boots, sword, grabbing, and just ruffled through his body. Somebody found his body, recognized who he was, and laid him out that way for a specific reason. So why in the world, Mary, and I'll quiz to you, why would someone on the other side of the army, which is what it would have been probably the night before they skedaddled off to Nashville, why would someone take care of someone on the other side in that manner?
Because he's like Lytle. He was a Mason.
He was a Mason, exactly. So when you take a peek at Patrick Clayborne, you have to look at Freemasonry here. And this is not written anywhere. This is just speculation. Now, I will tell you in disclosure, I am a Freemason, so I understand a lot of this stuff. Every one of the division commanders in Cheatham's army, with Patrick Clayborne, Brown, Bate, including Cheatham and Hood, were all Freemasons, as was Allegheny Johnson, Carter Stevenson, Henry Clayton, William Loring, Samuel French, Edward Walthall. They all were. These guys were all Masons. The soldiers who attacked him, okay, this is back on Schofield, right? This is Thomas Ruger and James Riley. They were all Masons. Okay, I think what happened was somebody recognized Clayborne. We're going to talk about Clayborne here in a second, his details with Freemasonry. They recognized him as a Mason. So here, why would they? Patrick Clayborne, in 1852, was raised as a Master Mason in Helena, Arkansas in 1852. He was a leader in his lodge. He was elected the master of his lodge in 1853. He was given the Royal Arch Mason degree and was conducted by none other than Albert Pike, who was also from Arkansas. So if you have Albert Pike coming to do one of your degrees, you're big time. That's just the way it was. Clayborne gave a keynote speech at the annual convention of the Arkansas and Mississippi Freemasons. My own opinion, not fact, so it's probably a fact. I think some soldiers recognized Clayborne for who he was, and they think they were Masons, very similar to the Bingham story with Armistead.
Yep.
And they laid him out hoping that somebody would give him a Masonic funeral. Because the way he was laid, if anybody's a Freemason knows, that's a very Masonic way he was laid out.
Yeah.
And his body was eventually taken to the Carnton House and was eventually buried, and his body bounced around a little bit. But I think some Union guys recognized him as a member of the craft, and they took care of him.
The one thing you and I were talking about today was the wound he received. There are some reports that say it was right through the heart, but there's some that was through the abdomen. And you had mentioned that if it had been through the abdomen, he would have bled out. So there very well could have been Union men there with him, or somebody with him, when he died. And he was able to tell them, I'm a Mason.
Well, there's a story that says, I think you read it earlier, that he was shot through the heart.
Yeah.
The higher you are, the less painful death you're going to get, right?
Yeah.
Because he was shot through the heart. The bullet wound is in his abdomen. So it would have taken him hours probably to bleed out. That would not have been a good death for him. So I bet you, to your point, Mary, I think you're absolutely right. I think he had people with him, and I think they took care of him. I do think some people got to him, and they would not have stolen his boots and laid him out. Somebody found his body, probably disheveled, and they cleaned him up and laid him out a certain way.
Yeah.
Hoping that his troops would eventually come and get him, find him, and take care of him.
Yeah.
It just makes way too much sense. Knowing too much of the stuff, it makes a lot of sense that that's how it was, because he was that highly thought of in that world.
Yeah. This is an opinion thing. It's not fact, but Simmons does write about Clayborne being a Mason in his biography of Patrick Clayborne called Stonewall of the West. So it is written about him being a Mason and him being very high up in the order.
Now, we are going to do an episode at some point with our friend Bill, who is a Freemason, who's in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He does a presentation on Gettysburg Civil War Freemasons. We'll have him on. But this is a very underreported Freemason story, because if you know all the details of this, there is no doubt this is very similar to the Armistead story. And I've not heard the story, Mary. I've not seen anyone talk about this, but it makes way too much sense. It's just the way it was. It makes way too much sense.
Yep. No, I completely agree with you. And I think it's good that we're discussing this as we move forward doing these battles. This could be something that we look for is kind of these Mason elements that happen. I mean, it happens in the March of the Sea. You're going to see that in you're reading Southern Storm right now, right? So
Yep.
there's definitely mention of Freemasons in that. It's like Lytle at Chickamauga. He was a Freemason, and it's Confederate men who protect his body. So there is a definite brotherhood that goes above this fighting, that it's suddenly like, this is not the enemy, this is a brother, and we have to look after him. And this is clearly what has happened with Cleburne as well. And plus, he was very high up too. Like, he had to be known.
He made it very far very quickly. So if he's a Royal Arch, 5th degree in the York Rite, he would have moved along pretty quickly. But again, it just goes to show what he could have been, to your point, Mary, what he could have been if this battle never happened, which realistically, I don't care. It never should have happened. It shouldn't have. It was just stupid. It was an unnecessary waste of a lot of human life on both sides for nothing. But what he could have become, I think you're absolutely right. He would have been like a Longstreet or a Mosby, someone who probably would have helped with the restoration of the Union afterwards.
Yeah.
He was still only 36 when he died. So he would have been 37 when the war ended. So he had his whole life ahead of him.
Yeah.
And
so he left behind a fiance.
He did.
Sue
We talked about her.
Yeah, Sue Tarleton. He met her at Hardy's wedding maybe a year prior to this, and he left her behind. She ended up marrying another Confederate. He was a captain in the Confederate Army, but she died less than a year after that. But she went into mourning for a year after Cleburne died. So that's another kind of human side of this, is like, he's a guy that had he had a fiance. He was planning to have a life with her, and his life, whether you're Union or Confederate, it's cut short. A guy that he's probably one of the bigger what ifs in the Civil War. What could he have helped do for Reconstruction?
He very easily could have fought for the Union. I mean, he landed in Arkansas from Ireland. That's where he fought, because that's where he went.
Well, he lived in Ohio.
But Arkansas is what kind of claims him.
And exactly. And that's because of the Mason thing, I think.
Right.
Like that
but
quote
if
I cited.
If he stayed in Ohio, or he moved to Mass or Vermont or somewhere and just stayed there instead, who knows how it would have been. And you know what? Yes, he's a Confederate. No one justifies a cause we're fighting for. But at some point, you got to look at the fact that it's a human who was killed, who had probably had a lot of promise, who probably would have done a lot of good things for the post-Civil War United States. Yeah,
and he had brothers and half-siblings, because his father actually remarried after his mother died, who lived in Wisconsin, and they fought for the Union, and he lived in Ohio. And I think the only reason he fought for Arkansas was because in Helena, he finally found his home, and it was especially after he became a Freemason. Yeah. That's what I took away from reading Simmons' biography about him, was that he found a place to call home. He didn't really have an opinion on slavery at all, other than his order to emancipate them. I see him as being very separate from somebody like Stonewall Jackson or Robert E. Lee.
He was fighting for his team to win, is what he was fighting for.
Yeah.
I mean, based on his Emancipation Proclamation he wrote that didn't come out till later, he realized what needed to be done for his side to win, and they just did. It was that quote about if we arm our slaves, what are we fighting for? Whatever the hell that phrase was. Yeah. But I think he's a guy who probably had a big future. So it's really too bad. But there's a lot of people. Those other 5 guys, those generals who died.
Mm-hmm. But all the soldiers that are cut down too. Like, how many soldiers' lives are ended at this battle? I agree with you. It didn't need to happen. And I know Hood, he writes about the remorse he feels after the battle, but then somebody that's with him writes that General Hood stopped close to where I was standing and took a long retrospective view of the arena of the awful contest. His sturdy visage assumed a melancholy appearance, and for a considerable time he sat on his horse and wept like a child. Even he is seeing what has happened, and I'm sure he carried that with him for the rest of his life.
Or himself.
Yeah, exactly. Right. As his friend, Sherman, they later became friends. Which is crazy after those SMD letters they write each other in Atlanta.
It's funny how life is, but I think at the end of the day, I think people need to study Franklin for more of what it is, which is just, it's just a butcher shop of a battle. And it wasn't like they were fighting for any sort of a major strategic point or anything like that. They were fighting for the sake of killing at that point, and it was just over the top, over and over frontal assaults, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, that led to nothing. He compounds it by doing the same thing in Nashville to a lesser degree. Again, the war was over at that point, and whether Nashville was captured or not, Sherman was going to do his thing. We were saying before about what Hood should have done. Sniping at Sherman's backside probably wouldn't have been the best idea. I still wonder what would have happened if they got him and had him march diagonally towards Virginia to try to
Yep.
hook up with Lee somewhere, and maybe that would be a little better tactic, maybe.
Yep.
But again, that's hindsight being our benefactor with this. We have no idea.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
don't underestimate Hood's psychological desire to basically redeem himself for Atlanta. And
Yeah.
people will deny that, but I'm sorry. There's too much to that.
Yeah.
He wanted to win because he lost. He knows he lost Atlanta, and this was his redemption. Taking it Nashville would have been, in his mind, the redemption. He just went at it too hard, and it was just too bad.
Yep. And I think Claiborne had the same thing in his mind. He was like, God, I fucked up at Spring Hill. My men are not like this. And I think he felt it was like an insult to his men who had fought so hard for so long. I think he was a scapegoat in this case. Cheatham's men were like, him and Brown were the scapegoats in this for Spring Hill. And Claiborne just felt he had to prove himself. But just to see, like, the loyalty of his men, how they're like, we knew he wasn't coming back. Like, it was just absolute carnage. And I think you see that when you visit the battlefield. From what I've heard about various people on Twitter, go to the Carter House, which is where actually there was Todd Carter was fighting at the Battle of Franklin. He dies in his own bedroom a few days after this battle at the Carter House.
It's awful. It's
which
almost
you can
like
now go see, and it's riddled with bullet holes. You can see daylight through it. Like, the awesome thing about like where the battlefield is there's the Battle of Franklin Trust, which has done an incredible amount of preservation. And I know they've worked with battlefields on this as well. But the site where Patrick Claiborne was killed used to be a Pizza Hut of all places. That has since been torn down, and now there is a marker there for where he fell, which I think is quite appropriate to have that. And there's been a lot of preservation work. So Battle of Franklin Trust is definitely something, since it's Giving Tuesday, that you can join.
Yeah, and it's unlike a lot of the battlefields. It's not a national military park. So they're not guaranteed federal funds like Gettysburg or Antietam or these places. It's similar to it's a bigger version of Kernstown, which is a privately owned place. So if you're looking, today is Giving Tuesday here. I know this will drop on Saturday, but if you have some money to drop, split your money between the American Battlefield Trust and throw some money at the Franklin Trust too, because something, these places are going to go away eventually unless the money's put into them. And so
and Franklin to me is just as important of a battle as Gettysburg. Like it needs to be the story needs to be told. And I have to say, the story this year, just on Twitter alone, was amazing to see it being told. So I got to say, like, thank you to Homebrew History, which is another history podcast. Like, they did a really great job of telling the story of not just the Battle of Franklin, but the Franklin-Nashville campaign. And they were really awesome. They tagged us in those tweets so we would be able to see them and, kind of help them out and retweet them with that too. So that's really awesome that they did that. So kudos to them for doing that and kind of making this battle more of awareness to it.
Appreciate battlefields. All battlefields matter. They really do.
American Battlefield Trust did an awesome job with Franklin as well with tweeting about it. It was really great to see the coverage this year of it.
And we need to thank the Battlefield Trust, Mary, because they gave us gear this week.
They
gave
did.
us license plate covers and stickers today.
Sticker.
I put mine on the other day, so thank you so much, the American Battlefield Trust, for hooking us up. It's already on my car, so it's great to do that. I know you were glad to get rid of that horrific Ohio State one.
I went out there on Saturday morning before our live and did that. It felt so good to do that and get rid of that off my car. And
that's good to get rid of that.
But yeah, like I'm probably the only person in Ontario driving around with an American Battlefield's license plate holder on my car.
With 4 inches of snow on your roof too, so that's another thing.
Yeah, that was my morning.
So anyway, moving on to future coming attractions like we always do, Mary.
Yep.
So we'll be doing our Facebook Live at 10 o'clock in the morning next Saturday, which is always a lot of fun. Hopefully there's no technical difficulties. I'm not sitting in my driveway in front of my garage again. And hopefully your internet is a little bit better off, and your AOL.com dial-up. Hopefully you got that going again. And then next week, what are we doing next week, Mary?
Are we doing our Christmas episode? Or
I think we're doing our. I thought we were doing our Civil War Breakfast Club Christmas Spectacular.
I think we are. Yeah.
Our Santa McClaus episode. We will talk about that. So we'll decide for sure, but there's good things coming down the pike. I believe that's what we're doing. So we will talk at our Civil War Breakfast Club World Headquarters and decide what the best option is to do. So anyway, Mary, it's Franklin was a good thing, a good discussion. I thought it was a good history discussion. Had some fun. Everyone, thanks for watching and thanks for listening and do all that good stuff. And definitely join our live. We'll talk about this. I'm sure we'll have some people talking about Franklin. There's a lot of people who watch us on the live who jump on board who appreciate Franklin as well.
So anyway, thank you to all of our listeners for listening, and those of us who join us on our live. We will be doing our roundtable again in December. I believe it is 2 weeks from tomorrow.
third Wednesday of every month, we are doing our roundtable from 6 to 7.
Yeah, 6 to 7.
6 to 7. So that a couple weeks down the road. So set your wake the neighbors, tell the kids, let everybody know that we'll be doing it. So, but in the meantime, Mary, always a pleasure. Hopefully the snow melts. Hopefully you can get to work tomorrow. It'll be the first time in like 5 days or 6 days you'll be back to work. So that Dairy Queen and Kim Carden's missing you outside.
I know. It is.
Good. Anyway, so thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks, appreciate it. So again, check us out on our live, and we appreciate all the fun we have on social media with everybody, and we will definitely look forward, Mary, to you and everybody else talking to you on the other side as we put a bow on this one.
See you guys later.
Hey.
Bye.
Peace out.